Welcome to The Other Worlds, where we talk to authors of fantasy, supernatural, and paranormal stories. Let's open the portal and meet our guest. Good morning. My name is Sandra Dan, and I am here today with Samantha Shannon, whose fifth book in the Bone Season series has just come out, The Dark Mirror. You're a New York Times bestseller, a Sunday Times bestseller, and have several novels out today in two different series. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Now, we decided to start out with some fun questions. So, I'm wondering which member of Paige's crew would you get along with best?
Oh, goodness. I think probably Eliza. Eliza's just very sweet and she's a really, really good friend. She really values loyalty. She particularly loves being in the gang because to her it's like a family. So she considers everyone in the group to be kind of like a sibling. So I think she would be a lot of fun. And she's also pretty good in a crisis. You know, she knows how to get out of sticky situations, even though she might not initially give that impression. And I think that Nick is also a solid choice for a friend from the gang. He's also very useful. He is an actual genius for one thing, and he's also very good at fixing wounds and all manner of things like that. So yeah, probably Nick and Eliza, who are also the people that Paige gets along best with. So that probably makes sense.
Probably does. And actually, they both seem they're different and yet complementary because they both provide a lot of valuable support to Paige in different ways. Uh,
Yes.
and it's actually one of the things that I really enjoy about this series is that Paige is surrounded by a lot of good people. There isn't this
Yeah.
sense that everybody is just about to put a knife in her back. There's the sense that people really want her to do well, and I feel that like from Maria and from Tom and others throughout the series. As far as I've gotten, anyways. I'm on book three, so so I really love that. Was that a deliberate choice on your part that you wanted her to have strong support?
Yeah, for sure. Even though this is a dystopian series, I'm very aware that dystopian fiction can get extremely overwhelming if it gets too dark. And for a series of this length, you know, the fact that you're having to immerse yourself in this incredibly, frightening place, the Republic of Sion, I didn't want it to feel like it was going to snow the reader under too much. I wanted there to be moments of levity and joy, and I think that's really important in dystopian fiction because it reminds the reader what these characters are actually fighting for. You know, they're fighting for their friends, they're fighting for their family, they're fighting for love and hope. So I really wanted to keep having reminders of that. Also, while Paige is from a criminal organization, which might not feel like the first place that it's going to be full of kind and decent people, it actually is because the reason that the clairvoyants are criminals is through no fault of their own. A lot of them are very great people who have been forced into this world of crime in order to protect themselves from Scion. So it made sense to me that there would be quite a mix of moralities in there, despite appearing to be this quite hard, a sort of unsympathetic organization.
Oh, that makes sense. Now, if you were transported into their world, which role in the syndicate would you fit into?
I think I would probably want to be a Molisher because you're essentially like the lieutenant of a mime lord or a mime queen. So you're not having to take on. Oh, maybe actually no, maybe because Molishers end up doing it. Kind of depends on the mime lord or mime queen, right? Sometimes they take the responsibility for everything, while the Molisher is just their support, which is what they're meant to be. But then sometimes you get mime lords who rely entirely on their Molishers and force all the work onto them. So I think if I had a nice mime lord or mime queen, I would want to be a Molisher because then you're like their backup and their right hand. But they should be the ones who are being in charge. Whereas, yeah, I'm not sure if I'd want to be a Molisher to certain mime lords. Like working for Jackson would be quite a stressful experience, I think. But yeah, I think I would like to be in kind of one of the dominant gangs, I think, because you would be safest, even though it's high pressure.
Do you think that you would make a good underqueen?
No, I'm very, very bad at making decisions. So Paige and I are almost polar opposites on this. Paige will make decisions really quickly without fully thinking of the repercussions of that decision. Whereas I'm so bad with decisions that it took me 6 years to choose the tiles in my kitchen. And they're great tiles, but it took me a really long time to get there. So I would just be dithering the whole time. And yeah, Sion would just never get defeated because I would be too busy like trying to think about all the consequences, all of the possible things that could go wrong, and nobody would ever move. So unfortunately, I don't think I would make a very good Underqueen. And there are moments when Paige doesn't make a good Underqueen for various reasons as well. So it's a difficult role to hold.
Well, I find myself thinking about the fact that she is 19,
Mm,
and at times I have felt like she really kind of has an author brain, because I think that as authors, when you're thinking about plot and thinking about the development of the story and the character arcs, you're trying to project how all of these different decisions will affect the story as it progresses and affect each character. And it seems like in the song Rising that she's trying to do this. She's really trying to do this in Manchester without giving any more away,
mm.
for anybody who hasn't read the series yet. It feels like she's really trying to weigh her options because she's caught between difficult choices, and 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 yet she's 19, and nobody, well, okay, maybe some people in this world have foresight, but this is not something that she particularly has, and she has to make these decisions and struggles with it. And there's a decision that she makes early on in that book that ends up paying off, in terms of giving them access to a place to withdraw to a safe space. And and yet when she made the decision that she made, she didn't make it with the foresight that it was going to have um, a positive effect later. And and so I'm wondering, like, did that affect her self confidence, that she benefited from decisions that she made without understanding the potential benefits, which was great, but at the same time, it wasn't like she deliberately made it. And she does sort of have a crisis of confidence throughout the book. Is that something that is affecting her, that she's not seeing payoff from her decisions, or that she's not anticipating the potential outcome of her decisions?
Yeah, and the whole of the song Rising, I didn't want Paige to suddenly become this, super, super competent person straight away, because like you said, she is really young and she is having to rely to some degree on her commanders and the people around her to help inform these decisions that she's making. But the problem is that Paige is not very good at delegating. So even though there are people around her who could advise her, sometimes she disagrees with them, but also sometimes she just wants to take the full responsibility for these decisions herself because she feels like she started this revolution and therefore she has to be on the front lines of everything, which doesn't really make sense for the leader of the syndicate. It's kind of like how monarchs, they delegate to people who are not themselves, and that's traditionally how the syndicate has operated. But Paige wants to be a different sort of underqueen who's more active and who takes an active role in not only the revolution but like looking after her people and showing them courage and inspiring them. So yeah, she does end up having quite a serious crisis of confidence in that book, which is funny because The Songwriting is actually the book that gave me a crisis of confidence in being a writer. It's much shorter than the other books, you may have noticed, and it's partly because I just really, really struggled with the plot, and it took me several years to write that book, despite it being so small. So I felt like Paige and I were going through a crisis of confidence together. But I think for a 19-year-old, she's doing incredibly well. I mean, she's very, very strong, and she's not always great under pressure, but she tries so hard, and her heart is really in it in an authentic way.
It's so interesting that you say that that this book is the one that gave you a crisis of confidence, because uh, when I got the email from Bloomsbury about the possibility of covering the Dark Mirror, I read the description and I was like, this is fascinating. I want to read this, but I hadn't read the series. And so I was like, well, I would need to start with book one. And they were great. They got me a copy of book one and sent it to me. And then I was like, as soon as I finished that, I was like, oh, I can't get to the bookstore today. So bought the ebook for the next book and went right into it. And now I'm on book three. And I love it. I mean, I think it's a fantastic series, and I'm sort of in awe of the pacing and the character development and the series of events and how it's unfolding and how the series is progressing. And you had this planned out as a 7-book series. So, um, it's interesting that though that as you progress as a writer, there are things that you learn, there are things, and then there are ways that you try to challenge yourself. And do you think that it was people's expectations that made it hard for you with this book? That, have the series having gained some traction and getting a following made it harder to live up to what you thought you should deliver for readers, or was it something else that was affecting you?
It was a mix. So I was definitely aware of having an audience by that point. And, when you write your debut, you don't have an audience. So you're just thinking about telling yourself a story that you're going to love. And then by the time the songwriting happened, yeah, I was definitely aware that I had people waiting for more books by that point, and I was putting myself under pressure. So what basically happened is that I rushed the first draft because of that keen awareness that I had an audience. And especially in publishing, there's this slight pressure to put out a book at least once a year. Um, it's more common in young adult fiction because there's this assumption that the readers are going to age out of it. But even in adult, there is still a little bit of background pressure to, keep pumping out books. And I basically, yeah, I rushed the first draft, and that meant that it took a lot of repairs during the editing process. And this ended up actually working in my favor because during that time, I wrote The Priory of the Orange Tree. And I might not have ever written that if I didn't have so much trouble with the songwriting because it was with my editor for such long periods of time doing, just going back and forth trying to figure out how we were going to fix it. I think the problem was that I wrote it as a bridge book between book 2 and 4 rather than being a strong narrative that could stand by itself. And I think that was the key problem. And I'm happy with the songwriting now. I think it's a very quick, pacey read. It's like the fastest book in the series. And that's partly, I think, because the editor I had working on it was a young adult editor originally. So both of us, I think, were trying to figure each other out. And the editor was, I don't think she was really used to doing adult. So I think it reads more like a YA novel in terms of pace. So it does feel a bit different from the other Bone Season books, which are much chunkier and slower and they feel more adult. But yeah, I think every author has that book that just nearly breaks them and convinces them that they're not actually a very good writer. And when you read it as an outsider, you have no idea. And I've read friends, like author friends, who've said the same thing about certain books, and I read them and I think they're great, but behind the scenes, there was a whole crisis of confidence going on.
Well, I actually think it's perfect for the story that it is very pacey because we're in a rapid fire situation where decisions have to be made quickly and things are happening within a very short span of time. It's not like I've counted the days up to where I'm at, but um it's not a very long period of time within that book. And so it's just kind of going, going, going. But that's very realistic and makes you kind of feel like you're actually in their shoes of just like the whirlwind and trying to make decisions when you're fatigued and hungry. I notice that Paige forgets to eat a lot. Is that something that you do?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, I try not to emphasize that too heavily because I think it can play into the whole thing with dieting culture. Like when I used to have disordered eating as a teenager, I used to claim to forget to eat quite a lot. So actually, when I went back and revised the songwriting, I saw that in there and I just wanted to add more of an explanation for the reason that she's not eating, which is that she just feels consistently sick with anxiety. And I had really severe anxiety when I was writing the Bone Season, especially in the lead up to it being published. And I just constantly felt like so viscerally sick to my stomach that I just could not eat often for hours and hours or days even. So I just wanted to be clear on why she's having that issue. But yeah, she's really, really tired. And I think sometimes I've read readers getting a bit frustrated with Paige's decision making. But I really wanted it to be emphasized that you cannot make great decisions when you are stressed and hungry and you haven't slept well. It's so important. If she's operating on a few hours sleep, she's not going to be making great decisions. And again, she is very, very young as well.
Exactly. It's funny. I The dieting culture never even occurred to me. because I have a digestive disorder. So I have to plan my whole day around when I can eat in case I have any issues or
Yeah.
reactions, right? And so, and then there are times that my stomach's just unsettled and I can't eat, and or I'm really limited. So for me, she resonates right across with something that I experience in my daily life. And but then when you add in the stress, and travel stress is another factor in it in this book as well, because that throws your whole um, rhythm off, I
Yes.
find. So, and this is something as well that she hasn't done. She's completely out of her comfort zone.
Yeah.
Um, so I found that fascinating. And actually, it was something that I was thinking about reading the books. Like to this point, each book has had distinct settings. You have moved her. And I listened to your interview with your event with Saba Tahir at Politics and Prose. And so I'm aware that you have a different setting as new settings as well in the Dark Mirror. And so I was wondering how deliberate it was for you that to keep changing the settings and why you decided to do that.
Yeah, I hope I came across okay in that interview because I had had 2 hours sleep and I felt completely incoherent. I'm just very glad I had Sabah as a moderator because she's so great and she was able to guide me through the conversation. But yeah, I was very tired at that event.
Oh,
So
you did
hopefully I
great.
was making sense.
You
Thank
did
you. So yeah, with the setting, that was a very intentional decision. In the dystopian genre in general, particularly in the classic dystopias that I was reading when I was at university, like 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale, The Hunger Games, all of those tend to be just set in one place, like one country, one city, one community. And usually that is the point because these societies are restrictive and closed and they don't like people to see beyond them. For me, though, when I was reading books like The Hunger Games, I was always asking myself, like, what is going on outside America in this book? And Suzanne Collins just never really goes into it. You don't know if the rest of the world still exists or if there's been nuclear war or like rising seas and everyone else is gone. But I was quite intrigued by the idea of what if the rest of the world was still there and they were watching, America hold the Hunger Games. And what would that be like? And I was inspired by The Handmaid's Tale. There is a scene in The Handmaid's Tale where Offred, the main character, she actually sees a tourist coming in from outside into this dystopian, tyrannical Republic of Gilead. And I was fascinated by that because, you do have situations where, countries are living under tyrannical regimes, but people are still allowed to go there on vacation and be tourists. And I was just really, it was sort of horribly fascinating idea. So I decided I wanted to combine the hallmarks of the dystopian genre with the scope of an epic fantasy. So we were going to see the dystopia not just in one city, the city of London, but we were also going to see how it interacts with Oxford. I wanted to see what the north of England and what Scotland are like in comparison. I wanted to, how would the English colonial relationship with Ireland be expressed in a setting like this? And then I thought, well, I'd like to take that further. Like, why don't we go to France and see how France operates differently under the same system? And then I would thought it would be fascinating for Paige to see the world from outside Sion as well. So The Dark Mirror is the first book where she goes outside the Republic of Sion for the first time in about a decade. And it was so interesting to write that because you see how closed Sion is. And Paige is encountering things like jeans for the first time. She's having a cappuccino, which is something that she's never heard of. So I'm trying to defamiliarize our familiar world, which is essentially what Paige is walking into, and to show that as being a sharp contrast to the world that she's just come from. So I really enjoyed that. And it was always very intentional from the beginning that I was going to explore this world in that way.
Now, it's interesting to me that you have this epic fantasy story, this series, and at the same time, you have grounded it in a future reality for our actual world. So you're referencing real places and real things. And one of the things that you talked about in your event with Saba, at the end, there was somebody who asked you about using the single quotations, and I was almost a little sad with your answer, not because of what you said, like not about you answering it and what you said exactly, but just the reality because I grew up in Canada, so we would often get a British author's book would come from the British publisher. An American author's book would come from the American publisher because that was usually where they sold their primary rights. And so their home country had the right to distribute in Canada. To me, we got the best of both worlds, but I was completely comfortable switching back and forth between single and double quotations and things like this. It's just normal to me, but I was still aware that, like, for example, like 20 years ago, this really dates me. Ian Rankin would talk about Americanizing his novels and you would need to take out things like vacant buddies and because people in America didn't understand it. And when I was reading your novels, I thought, these aren't Americanized. This is
Mm.
wonderful. I feel like I'm right here. And I was wondering if you had been able to get away with that more because it was fantasy, but it just turns out that it's more of a trend that people are moving away from it. Is that's what you think?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned this during the event, but my books did used to be Americanized. Not extensively, but certain words were removed, and obviously the spellings were changed, and the speech marks were turned into double speech marks, and that sort of thing. And the reason that I ended up basically my books are no longer Americanized, and the reason for that is because when The Mask Falling was published, Paige's voice, I use, Irish specific words in her voice because she's Irish. And a few of them had been changed without my permission to the American versions of those words. And for me, that, first of all, it didn't make sense because Paige is not American. Just doesn't make sense for her to be using, American words that she would never have heard of. But also the book is so much about the series is about the fact that Paige has had that Irishness forced out of her by this system that expects her to sound and behave in a certain manner, specifically an English manner. And I felt like that Americanization was almost replicating that this idea of Paige having to have this homogenous, acceptable way of speaking English. And so I pushed back against that. And Bloomsbury, to their credit, were, I don't think they really had realized that I didn't want that to be done. And after that, it was pretty much decided that my books were not going to be Americanized anymore. And I think it is better because, we get American books in the UK, and there's lots of words that I was not familiar with when I was young, like something like valedictorian, for example. And you don't know those words, but you just learn them, and it's you're expected to do that the other way around. So I don't know. I just think it's a bit strange that if I was American, I think I would feel patronized by it. This idea that everything had to be changed to suit my understanding when I could just look it up.
Well, and it's so much easier now with the internet as well. I mean, we have easy access to this information, and,
Mm,
and so why not take advantage of that? But like also, your books are dealing with themes of, imperialism, colonization, and one of the tactics in colonization was suppression of language.
mm,
And of course, that's a huge issue for indigenous populations um, in North America and I'm sure many other places around the world. But it was also an issue in Ireland. And
mm.
I had wondered, and I consider this a little, I'm not sure how valid this source is when I was researching you, but it says on Wikipedia that your father's um, Irish background. And I wasn't sure if that was accurate or not, but I wondered if you did have some Irish heritage.
Yes, it's ancestry on my father's side. So my father's ancestors left Ireland, we think, during the famine.
Mhm.
And then they moved to Northern England and stayed there for a few generations. And then my father moved to London and met my mother, which is how I ended up with my London accent. But yeah, I was really interested in exploring. I think English authors need to do more to talk about the relationship between Britain and Ireland. It's something that we're very reluctant to discuss. It's something that isn't really talked about in schools. And that also extends to England's treatment of Scotland and Wales. So we had something called the Welsh Not, for example, where Welsh people were prevented from speaking their own language. And it's just, I mean, Britain in general has a problem with acknowledging imperialism. I think politicians would like us to forget that we ever had an empire, or that if we had one, it actually wasn't all that bad. They don't really teach like the genuine human horrors of the empire and things that it did. And I wanted to be part of trying to change that as someone who is English but whose ancestors came from Ireland. I wouldn't be here if they hadn't moved from Ireland to England. So yeah, I suppose I just wanted to embrace those parts of me and try to explore my relationship with being a member of the diaspora.
Do you speak Gaelic?
Oh, I wish I spoke Gaeilge, but I don't, unfortunately. I have a wonderful translator called Kieran Collins, who does the Irish translations in the book, which is lovely of him. And it was important to me to include it. Unfortunately, I am learning Spanish, which I did for 8 years, and my brain just does not seem to be able to learn two languages at the same time. I do not have the capacity for that, sadly.
Oh, I mean, language is very challenging. Whenever I'm traveling, I try to learn a little bit in the local language to at least be able to say hello to people or ask basic questions. And there are some languages that your brain just does better with than others. And I do think that it is very challenging. I actually spent some time living in Ireland in 1990. So, very Dairy Girls kind of era, and but there was a lot of talk about it at the time because the family I was living with, they were talking about how the schools were, mandating that children learn their language now, and of course it becomes a bit of a debate, and we get this in Canada as well, where you see signs that are in Indigenous languages, signs that are in French, and I thought that it was really wonderful that you were incorporating so much. Also, that Paige remembered and held on to so much of her language. And in your interview with Saba, you talk about, I think you mentioned that there are going to be several different, um, different dialects that are used in the books. And
Oh, yeah.
is it the same translator for all of those?
Oh, it is. I was actually talking about like the accents more than the dialects. So it was I think I might have been talking about the audiobook possibly. Maybe that might have been what was happening. Um, Sorry, again, I was on very little sleep at this event, so I can't remember exactly. But I think I probably did mention that Alana Kerr Collins, who narrates the audiobooks, she has to do 6 different regional variations of Irish, I think, in over the course of the books. She's an incredibly impressive narrator. She really puts so much effort and thought and research into how to voice the characters, and she has to do a lot of accents in this series. There's so many different accents from all across Europe, but yeah, she made sure that she gave each of the Irish characters their own distinct regional dialects, sorry, sort of regional accent based on where they're from.
And has this been a great opportunity for you to learn more about your ancestry and your father's heritage?
Well, the thing that's really frustrating and the thing that I touch on in the series is that my theory is that we can only trace my father's ancestry back so far because at some point their surname must have been anglicized from an Irish surname into the anglicized Shannon. And there is more than one Irish surname that was turned into Shannon. So I feel a bit stuck because I don't know what their surname was supposed to be. At some point, the scribes must have just started writing the anglicized version of it. Paige's name is anglicized in the book as well. And I've always found it very frustrating, that whole process, that this idea that the Irish language is somehow too difficult to be learned and properly respected. So a lot of the time the names were anglicized. It doesn't appear to be with a great deal of thought for the meaning or the sound. So that's, yeah, something I did want to address in the book. I think we've traced back as far as we can, but I might try again at some point. I'm going on a research trip to Ireland hopefully this year, so I might see if I can stop by Roscommon and see if I can dig any more.
Well, that would be great. That would be fascinating if you could learn more. I mean, as a Canadian, you're sort of behind 57, really, when it comes to ancestry, and it is very hard to trace. Um, my father and grandfather were Orangemen, um, and yet it was my grandmother's maiden name that was Shaughnessy, and I'm so confused because Rattans are not like Rattan is not Irish. But so when we try to learn our ancestry, there's a lot of guesswork that goes into it, and you would think that you would have better access, um, you know, but struggle with the same issues that we face when we're trying to delve into all of this. So I was curious about Paige. Just one of the things I wondered about her, and of course I'm aware that the seeds for the series um, had more to do with plot based elements rather than the character, and obviously Paige became the main character of this series. How did you know that she had 7 books in her?
Well, she was partly created with the knowledge that I wanted to write 7 books. So I knew that she had to be someone really interesting to carry the reader through for that long. There was the option that I could have switched between perspectives, but it just felt a bit wrong to me. This very much feels like Paige's story that's filtered through the lens of her experience. And so I knew that it was going to have to be someone who could almost embody a range of perspectives. So she's living in London. She knows London like the back of her hand. But I wanted her to be both an insider and an outsider. So she is very much an insider in the syndicate. She holds a high rank in the criminal underworld. But she also remembers what it was like before Scion because she came from Ireland. So at one point, Warden calls her a Londoner and a daughter of Ireland. He talks about how she kind of brings these elements of important perspectives together in one person. So that was why I kind of created her with that background to some extent. Um, and yeah, I hope that her voice is, interesting enough to carry everyone through. I did want her to have a little bit of that lightness and self-deprecating humor sometimes. And she is someone who does have a strong sense of humor, and I felt like that was important again for a dystopian novel. She has to be able to laugh a little bit at her situation. So there's a bit in the first book where she's with her friend Julian, and there's a moment where they just burst out laughing because of just, even though they're in this horrifying situation, they can both see the sort of darkly funny side of it. And I wanted to lean into that with her voice a lot. So even though she is serious when the occasion calls for it, but I just wanted to make sure that her voice wasn't too doom and gloom the whole time.
Yeah, you do have to have some moments of levity, and to survive in this world. I've been thinking about this reading through book 3, and I was thinking about the fact that being in leadership is such a challenge, and particularly in the circumstances that she's in, really trying to lead a revolution, and and yet perhaps not having a clear picture because of how controlled information is, not having a clear picture of how to do that. And her best resources are people who have come from places that failed. And I feel like in this book she's really fighting to hold on to her soul, because Jackson and Hector, they sold their souls for leadership, and she's frightened in moments even by herself of how tough she's become in order to deal with some of the situations she's facing and try to get the information that she needs. And how do you walk that line in terms of she needs to be a tough leader, she needs to make mistakes, but we need to give her heart? And how do I balance this all out so that she does not feel like a walking contradiction to me at all? But sometimes people are like, oh, this character needs to be perfect or not make mistakes. Like, how do you weave in the mistakes and have it feel organic and natural, and make her so real to us?
Well, I think there is a little bit of a trope of, the female character coming into her own, but when she does that, she essentially has to become a soulless machine who's, constantly cutting down her enemies and being this sort of strong female character in capital letters. And I spent a lot of my early career talking about this because there was this constant conversation around strong female characters and what does strong mean. And at that time, it was like any form of vulnerability felt like it was almost being criminalized in female characters, which I just found bizarre because I don't relate to a character that isn't a bit human and makes mistakes and has flaws. And again, I think it makes sense with Paige's character. She's not a soldier, she's a scrappy criminal who was thrust into this very frightening situation, and she did her best based on the fact that she is a strong and adaptable person. And she spent years, living in Sion, knowing that everyone knowing that she was Irish and that she was being constantly criticized for that. So she knows how to endure difficult circumstances for a long time. But it just did not make sense to me that she was going to become this inhuman killing machine straight away. Um, she certainly does get harder as the series goes on, and there's a bit of a thing where I think her and Warden are almost slightly rubbing off on each other. So she almost slightly becomes more Rephite. She becomes a little bit colder, a little bit tougher, and Warden becomes more human in response to being so close to Paige. So there is that happening. But at the same time, he is quite a humanizing figure for her. He tries to keep her grounded and to remind her that it is okay to be kind. And there's a point in the series that in the Dark Mirror, actually, when he says to her, you know, if you become too much like our enemies, what are we actually fighting for? What's the difference between their side and ours? And she has to think about that because she's like, you know, if I just become as brutal as Sion, then we might as well just keep Sion. You know, it's you need to be offering a different future if you're doing a revolution. And yes, you do have to be driven to very difficult decisions and you have to make, you know, you make these very hard choices. And sometimes she does have to be cold and brutal when she's dealing with Scion officials. But the idea of being with a very cold and unfeeling Paige for the other seven books just wouldn't appeal to me at all. I much preferred the idea that she's trying to hold on to her humanity and she's trying to look after her friends. So in the songwriting, the situation with Ivy, where the syndicate wants to get rid of Ivy, but Paige is so keenly aware of how much Ivy has already gone through. It just feels very wrong to her to punish Ivy anymore. So I wanted that to be, you know, a pretty serious moral dilemma that she finds herself in. And when Liz does the reading, the tarot card reading for Paige in the first book, the card related to her hopes and fears is the Eight of Swords. And that card shows a blindfolded woman who is surrounded by eight blades. So essentially, any direction that she moves in is going to harm her. And that for me is a pretty good representation of what Paige is facing. She can choose whichever path between the swords that she wants, but she's always going to cut herself on the way. There is no easy path through this process.
That's a very interesting image of her situation that actually really nails it. So to wrap this up, I was wondering, what would Jackson think of you if he met you?
Um, I think he would think I was too much of a soft person. Jackson is, yeah, he's someone who does not really value emotions in quite the same way that Paige does. There's a moment in The Dark Mirror where Paige says something like, you know, my father didn't know what to do with my emotions, and Jackson resented their existence. He does like people to be very cold and quick decision makers. So I don't think Jackson would like me very much. I hope he would appreciate me as a fellow writer because he does very much value himself as someone who, you know, words are his whole existence, and a lot of his early power came through his use of words. So I think he would probably admire my attempt to make a career out of, you know, the craft of writing. But yeah, I don't think Jackson doesn't like many people, to be fair, and I can't see myself being one of the favored few.
Fair enough. Now I do have to ask, Scarlet Burnett, pardon me, Scarlet Burnish, was she inspired by like Alexa or Siri or something? I mean, I know that it's a person, but every time we're getting an announcement from her, I just feel like I feel like it's just Siri talking over like this programmed voice that's meant to soothe and you know, just kind of put a lid on things, keep people from getting too upset or too reactive.
Um, I can't remember when Siri and Alexa first came in because I created Scarlet in 2011, and it feels like certainly they were a lot less pervasive back then. I wrote the first book in 2011, so I don't think I had Siri on my phone unless I'm misremembering. It was more, I suppose she's more like kind of one of those frightening AIs, you know, in sci-fi that just, again, calming the population and just the idea of the propaganda machine as well as what she's supposed to embody, or even something like the mouth of what's this of Sauron from Lord of the Rings, just this mouthpiece for the evil empire. But yeah, she came into my head very strongly, and I liked the idea of Sion just having this one person who constantly read the news because they're all about safety and familiarity and security. So it made sense to me that they would have this familiar person who you feel like you can trust, to give you the right news. But of course, she's telling a pack of lies most of the time.
Whether she realizes it or not. I mean, it's a fascinating touch that I really enjoy in the books. But it definitely does remind me of how AI programmed we're getting with these, artificial assistants and
Mm,
voices and whatnot, and feeding us all kinds of information that is not always the most accurate or helpful even. So
yeah.
you've had so much going on. You have The Dark Mirror out now. You also have the Dawn Chorus novella just came out in audio.
Yeah.
And give us your pitch. Why should we tune into that? And when in the reading, does that follow the song Rising?
Yeah, it does. It comes right between the song rising and the mask falling. Technically, it should be read after the prologue of the mask falling. It just slots in there. So the Dawn Chorus, I would not necessarily recommend it for everyone because it is a pretty visceral depiction of recovery from trauma. And it goes into sort of depth about drug withdrawal and PTSD that might be a little bit difficult for some readers. But it was really important to me to write this because I think the problem is when you're writing a series like this, which is often quite pacey, there's lots of action, there's this pressure to keep the plot moving all the time, just forward, forward, forward. And often that's not really conducive to portraying trauma. Sometimes when people are traumatized, they just physically can't just carry on. And I wanted to use a new term to hold space for Paige's trauma in that novella. So it's pretty much that there's really no plot progression at all. It's just Paige reconnecting with Warden and trying to process this traumatic experience that she goes through at the end of the song Rising. And there's some flashbacks to Oxford, and there are again some lighter moments between Warden and Paige. But yeah, it's basically just an exploration of Paige's trauma and how it changes her and how that is as she goes into the next book in the series where she's forced back into the usual situation where things are constantly happening to her. So yeah, I think it's not 100% necessary to the plot to read it, but I think if you are a Bone Season reader, it's a good thing to read. I think it will give you a better understanding of who Paige is from this point in the series. And I just think I just wanted to honor what she had been through properly without just brushing it under the carpet like it didn't happen for the sake of plot convenience.
That sounds fascinating. I can't wait to read it. And how was it for you to hear it for the first time?
I just finished it today, like just before I got to this interview, and it's so good. Alana, again, she's such a wonderful narrator. Like she just pitches and modulates her voice so perfectly depending on the scene. So even down to things like if Paige is falling asleep in a scene, her voice will become almost slower and softer, almost like ASMR. And she's so great at the scenes where Paige is angry, like you can physically hear her voice like cracking and shaking, and it's so so good. It's very very well paced. She reads it like not too fast, not too slow. It's just great. I love listening to the audiobooks. I feel very lucky that we found Alana to do Paige's voice.
That sounds wonderful. Well, congratulations on all your success. Thank you so much for sharing your worlds and your characters with us. And I look forward to continuing on with the series. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me. This was a lot of fun.